Hey, good evening. It's Jason again from Fraser Valley Rose Farm. Well, let's start with this. When I use the word gallica to describe a rose, usually my customers respond with a question. Galla what? They say. Which is why I want to keep on making this series of short videos on the old garden roses to describe the classes of roses and how they are as garden plants. Now, before I go any further, quick piece of housekeeping. If you're having any trouble understanding when I try to pronounce Latin or French, hey, those aren't my first languages. But feel free to go to the bottom of the screen, look for the little icon that says CC or closed captioning. What I'll do after I've posted this on YouTube and YouTube transcribes my words, I'll go through all of that and I'll make sure that all the spelling is correct to the original language, and that way you won't have to rely on my pronunciation. Okay, going back a half step to the previous video I made on the damasks, I mentioned at the time that there were three roses that were probably present in the ancient world: the Romans, the Greeks, the Persians, the Egyptians. Those were the albas, the gallicas, and the damasks. And I also made the argument at the time that the damasks were really well suited to this purpose. The ancient civilizations liked to harvest the petals in mass for festivals and so on, and they loved the perfume of the rose, and the damask is perfectly suited to those purposes. If you wanted to look at a time and a place and a purpose of the gallica roses, I'm going to ask you to fast forward, say about 1,000 years. To France, between 1100 and 1800 is the peak of the Gallica period. It's a long time in history. And the Gallicas were used at the time, or increasingly so. Their use was to do with their symbolic use, their use as a garden plant, and it was related to their color, the color red. Back to that in just a second. But going from the time of the Romans and ancient civilizations to the Middle Ages there's some time that passes. What were the Gallicas doing in this time? Well, some stories have them, just like the damasks, retreating to the Eastern Roman Empire and then being picked up again by the Crusaders and brought back by knights and noblemen in that period. That may be true as well. Another source that I have, and the one that I trust, the story I trust the best, is that the Gallicas actually stayed in Europe and they were grown in monastery gardens, grown there for their herbal and medicinal purposes by monks. And the reason I think that's so compelling is that going into the Middle Ages, they come into it with a strong association to the Christian church, as well as medicinal use. So now back to the color red. You can see it in the name that they use for this rose. They call it the red rose of Lancaster, the red Provence, even the red damask, even though the plant is not a damask and is not red. The color of the roses is, as I say, not perfectly red, at least by my standards, but it is a fair sight darker than either the albas or the damasks. So going into that Middle Age period, the rose started to take on the symbolic associations that we currently take with the rose. That is, of the red rose being equated with love, passion. And it wasn't just the romantic passion, although there was plenty of that in the poems and stories and folklore of the time. Any story that had to do with romance or young lovers included some dovetail with the roses, but also with religious passion. The Christian church began to interpret or incorporate the rose into their symbols and their practices. So you'd see pictures of roses on stained glass windows and at altars and in their art. But you also began to see them using something like the rosary, which is a practice of the Catholic Church, and rosary beads and so on. And they started showing up in the Catholic or the Christian miracles of the day, the stories of roses being in miracles. So certainly it became more integrated into the religion at the time. So now I may as well introduce you to a couple of the roses right off here. The first one I have to introduce you to, because it is the most popular rose of that entire period, is the Apothecaries Rose. That's Rosa Gallica officinalis. They call it the Apothecaries Rose because it was strongly associated with its medicinal use. The apothecary shops, which would have been the medieval equivalent of the pharmacy, stocking all of the herbal remedies and so on. And they became so strongly associated with the Apothecaries Rose that it was their floral emblem. I think one source I read said that in Provence in the 16th century, you couldn't walk down the street without passing 10 apothecaries' shop, and each one of them would have the Apothecaries Rose planted in front of the shop as their floral emblem. The rose itself is not very sophisticated as far as the later Gallicas. I'll be showing you some of the more fancy Gallicas as we go on here. It's not very sophisticated. It's a semi-double or double, a strong pink color, not extremely well formed. You can see a little bit of, I guess you'd call it untidiness to the flower, but very revered during this time period, and it's sort of the mother of all of the Gallica roses. Now, a nice transition from the Apothecaries Rose would be then on to Rosa Gallica versicolor, which is a sport of the Apothecaries Rose. And it's also called Rosenwunder. Now that rose actually connects with one of the most popular pieces of rose folklore of all of history, the story of Fair Rosamund. So from that period, from 1100 to 1800, this is more on the front end of that period, around 1170, and starts with the characters of Henry II and Eleanor, and a young lady named Jane Clifford. Now, just to give you the folklore context of this, Eleanor and Henry were the parents of Richard the Lionhearted and Prince John, who later show up in the Robin Hood stories. So as the story goes, and not to let the truth get in the way of a good story, but probably most of this story is made up and added to as the centuries went on. But as the story goes, Jane Clifford was so beautiful that nobody actually called her by her first name. They called her the Fair Rosamund, after Rosamundi, the Rose of the World. So she was so pretty that they called her the Rose of the World. In any case, when Eleanor found out that Henry II was having an affair with the Fair Rosamund, he hid Rosamund away from her. In one of his country estates, he constructed an elaborate maze and put Rosamund at the center so only he could find her. Well, Eleanor went after her. And as the story goes, and borrowing even from the Greek mythology, Eleanor borrowed a tactic from Theseus and brought with her a spool of thread that she untwined as she tried to solve this maze towards the center so that she could find her way out again afterwards. When she found Rosamund in the center of the maze, she forced a choice upon her. Either die by the knife or take this poison. And the poison in this case would have been dissolved in the oil of the Apothecaries Rose. Well, Rosamund took the poison and died. And as the story goes, or at least one version of the story goes, one of the roses in the garden, the Apothecaries Rose in the garden, then sported a new branch, which had more beautiful flowers, and that was attributed to the Fair Rosamund. Another way that they connect the story with the flower is that they say that the peasants went to her gravesite afterwards and decorated it and dropped the Rosamundi flowers there by her grave. So that's an interesting and colorful story from the front end of the period. Towards the back end of this window I'm talking about, of the dominance of the Gallica roses, I really do have to introduce you to one other character, a real-life historical character, who is the Empress Josephine, who turned out to be so influential towards roses. So right around 1799, 1800, Josephine bought a chateau in the country called Chateau de Malmaison. And there she pulled together her botanical interest and spent scads of money. The Romans had nothing on her in terms of extravagance. She bought every botanical collection she could find, and her particular specialty was the roses. She put together a collection which at the time was the greatest rose collection in the world and the first rose garden of that scale anywhere. And it had about 200 to 250 varieties of roses, more than half of which were Gallicas. She also brought together a staff of gardeners. She loved the English style of gardening, so she brought English gardeners, French gardeners, a famous painter, Redoute, and she had people to catalog and chronicle her gardens. As it turned out, this great collection had a huge influence on the way that roses went forward. Not only was she like a pop culture figure of the time, so people after her would emulate her gardens, but the staff that she brought together began doing scientific crosses of the roses, deliberate crosses, whereas I think prior to this period of time, a lot of the crosses that would have happened in garden plants would have been sort of chance crosses that happened in the garden. In her case, her staff was doing deliberate crosses, and what followed after Malmaison was an explosion of brand new roses, rose gardens, and rose gardening in general. So what you could probably say fairly is that Josephine's garden represented the very peak of the Gallicas' popularity. What you would also say is that it was the beginning of the end, because it became so popular and so many other roses began appearing, crosses of everything they could get their hands on, that it transformed virtually over the next century to having dozens of classes of roses and many thousands of roses available that weren't Gallicas, were mixes of all sorts of different roses. All right, without further ado, I guess I should introduce you to some of the fancy roses that you maybe came here looking for. And the first one I'll picture here is Charles de Mills. Charles de Mills, as you can see, has just a ton of petals. You can't even see the center of this rose. It's a very deep pink. You might almost say red. The redder the better was the way that they were going for the breeding of these roses at the time, with a definite purple or mauve hue as it starts to fade out. A gorgeous rose. I grow it in my garden, and I've made other videos on the topic. But yeah, that's Charles de Mills. Now, as far as its health in the garden goes, somebody gave it the unfortunate nickname of Charles de Mildew, insofar as it does get powdery mildew and black spot on its leaves. So that's one bad thing about it, but it is a wonderful rose. The second one maybe I'll talk about here is Tricolor de Flandres. Now, I'm going to picture that one up here as well, and you'll notice that that one is quite similar to the Rosamundi that I pictured earlier, except that Tricolor de Flandres has a much better form, more petals, and in general is just a slightly more refined rose for your garden. So I grow the Rosamundi, I love it, but Tricolor de Flandres is probably a slightly more garden-worthy specimen if you can get your hands on it. The third one I'll show you here is Alain Blanchard, and this one you're going back to that simple form of flower, but what you can see, and maybe if you look real close here, you can see that the petals have an interesting and novelty kind of mottling. It's like it has almost spots or dots on the petals. Gorgeous effect in the garden. Wide open flower. In the title page of this video, I put La Belle Sultane, which also has a similar form and color, just doesn't have those splotches on the petals. And the last two that I'll show you here are both China hybrids, and one is Duchess de Montebello, and the other one is Cardinal Richelieu. Duchess de Montebello is a soft pink, and Cardinal Richelieu is as purple as you could possibly get within a rose. Some people thought they'd found the blue rose when they bred Cardinal Richelieu. Now, these are from the tail end of the dominance of the Gallica roses, and they would have been crossed most likely with a China rose, because lots of other roses were coming in at this point from different parts of the world. And they suspect that because the growth is taller, more upright, the stems are longer and smoother, so they have less prickles and so on. So they have more of the habit of the China roses in them, and that's the suspicion with those two roses here. I guess I should talk about how the Gallicas in general grow in the garden. And I'll rate them as lower than the Damasks in terms of their overall stature in the garden. They usually grow in my garden from 3 to 4 feet. And I guess the other thing you'd say about them is it's a low suckering growth. By suckering, I mean this is a habit of the rose where once it establishes in a patch, it's going to send another shoot down below the soil and run along. And sometimes it can run by 4 feet or 6 feet or 8 feet. Look up my video on rose suckers to see this on Charles de Mills actually. But it's a habit that will lend these roses to turning into almost like a thicket over time, or a low hedge. And if you don't mind it doing that, it's a great habit. Otherwise, you may choose to have it as a grafted specimen. If it's on grafted rootstock, it won't do that so much. In terms of overall health, I will give the Gallicas, I'm not going to say a low mark, but they certainly are not as healthy as your average rose in terms of foliar diseases. I mentioned Charles de Mills is particularly susceptible to mildew and black spot, but a lot of the Gallicas are a little bit susceptible that way, particularly in my wetter climate like this. So watch out for that. One thing I will say is that they do grow through it and they flower quite nicely anyway. So even though the foliage is rarely spotless, they do flower quite nicely anyway. They have a wonderful old rose scent. I won't say it's quite as strong as the damasks, but it is soft and sweet and does smell like an old garden rose. Well, I guess that's going to cover me for the Gallicas here, almost all the details I want to talk about. But I do like to save one last detail for the end of the video for those rose geeks who are happy to stick around for the whole thing. And that's the mystery of a rose called complicata. I grow complicata in my garden. I think everybody should. The one way you could describe the blooms of this rose is luminous. When it blooms in the garden, it's like it's bright from a long distance away, just glowing. The flowers are large, pink, and with white and I guess with the yellow stamens, yellow centers, and it fairly glows in the garden. Now, the mystery is that we don't know who the other parent is. It's often attributed as a Gallica, but it's clearly not fully of Gallica parentage. It's much, much taller, often makes a climber in your gardens. And so there's some speculation, I'm going to give you my thought on that, is that some people say that it's the dog rose, maybe other people say it's the Rosa rubrifolia, or the red-leafed rose. I think it's a macrantha. I visited a gardener friend of mine up in North Vancouver, and she was growing Rosa macrantha in her garden, and I was struck by how much that looks like Rosa complicata, and at least in its leaf form and overall habit. Some people have speculated that that's the other parent of complicata, and from my impression anyway, I would agree with that. Okay, that's everything now. So if you have any questions, comments, or even corrections, I'm not above that, please leave those below the video, and thank you so much for watching.